Today we're diving deep into the complete history and evolution of dragons in Dungeons & Dragons, from ancient mythological inspirations to their modern role in the game. Dragons are literally in the title of D&D, and over the decades, they've transformed from simple monsters to rich characters and even playable beings. In this long-form exploration, we'll journey through time, looking at dragons' origins in myth and fantasy literature, Gary Gygax's early vision for D&D's dragons, and how each edition of the game expanded their lore and mechanics. By the end, we'll see how dragons became the ultimate apex creatures of D&D, and speculate on where they might soar in the future. Grab your swords and spell books, and maybe a fire-resistant shield, and let's explore the legendary saga of D&D's dragons. Long before D&D existed, dragons loomed large in mythology and folklore around the world. The game's creators drew on a wide range of fictional and mythological sources in crafting D&D's dragons. Classic European legends of St. George and the Dragon, the greedy serpent Fafnir from Norse myth, and of course Tolkien's iconic dragon Smaug from The Hobbit, all helped shape the idea of what a dragon should be. Medieval bestiaries describe dragons as giant winged fire-breathing reptiles, formidable foes that only the bravest heroes could face. It's no coincidence that Dungeons & Dragons features the dragon as the second element of its name, because in epic literature, the dragon is traditionally recognized as the most dangerous creature of all. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the co-creators of D&D, knew the cultural weight dragons carried. From the very start, they envisioned dragons as the ultimate challenge in their fantasy game, the kind of enemy that could make players' eyes go wide and spur epic stories. Gygax once asked illustrator Larry Elmore for a basic set cover that would jump out at you, resulting in the famous image of a lone warrior facing a red dragon. In early D&D products, and Gary Gygax's own campaigns, dragons were apex predators, intelligent, powerful, and often evil creatures hoarding vast treasures. They were there to evoke a sense of awe and danger, the final boss at the end of a dungeon. As one scholar noted, D&D recognized the dragon as a most formidable opponent, keeping with the tradition of epic sagas. In short, myth and literature gave D&D a blueprint for dragons, and Gygax's early vision elevated them to the iconic apex monsters we know, creatures meant to test the mettle of any adventuring party. When Dungeons & Dragons was first published in 1974 as a small, white box set, dragons were among the very first monsters introduced. These earliest D&D dragons were relatively simple by later standards, but they established a foundation that the game would build on for decades. The 1974 edition included 6 types of dragons, 5 evil chromatic dragons, white, black, green, blue, and red, of increasing size and power, and 1 noble metallic dragon, the Golden Dragon, who was explicitly lawful good. This alignment-based distinction was there from the start. In the original game, only the Gold Dragon was good-aligned, while all the others were wicked. Most chromatic dragons were chaotic evil or neutral evil. Even in this first incarnation, dragons were meant to be fearsome adversaries. They could fly, bite, claw, and of course unleash devastating elemental breath weapons. For example, a red dragon could breathe fire, a blue dragon spit lightning, a black dragon spew acid, and so on. Abilities that made low-level characters think twice about disturbing a dragon's lair. In these early rules, dragons were essentially powerful monsters to fight and kill, or flee from. They didn't have the deep lore or personalities of later editions, but they captured players' imaginations. The very idea of finding a dragon sitting on a mountain of gold, ready to incinerate intruders, was irresistible. By 1975, the game's first supplement, the Greyhawk supplement, named for Gygax's campaign world, expanded the roster. It introduced 4 new metallic dragons, copper, brass, bronze, and silver, and it gave personal names to the archetypal dragon of each kind. This is where Bahamut, the platinum dragon, king of good dragons, and Teeamat, the chromatic dragon, queen of evil dragons, made their debut. They were presented as unique, godlike dragons at the pinnacle of their alignment groups. Already D&D was borrowing from mythology. Tiamat's name comes from Babylonian myth, and creating its own internal mythos. So by the mid-1970s, the template was set. D&D's dragons were color-coded for morality, shining metallics generally noble, vivid chromatics generally villainous. They were the ultimate monsters, appearing on the cover of the 1974 rules and defined in the text as beasts of tremendous power. Many gaming groups in the 70s had at least one tale of running into a dragon in a dungeon and barely surviving. In fact, one of the earliest published adventure modules, White Plume Mountain, 1979, referenced an undead dragon named Dragotha, hinting at bigger draconic threats lurking in Greyhawk's world. From day one, dragons captured the essence of high fantasy in D&D, embodying both the terror and the treasure that awaited bold heroes. In 1977, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, a D&D first edition, was released, compiling and refining the rules. In the very first monster manual of AD&D, dragons got even more attention. The 5 evil chromatic dragons, white, black, green, blue, red, and the 5 good metallic dragons, brass, copper, bronze, silver, gold, all appeared in its pages, each with detailed statistics and distinct alignments. Evil for chromatics, good for metallics. The first edition monster manual even gave each dragon a pseudo-Latin species name for flavor. For example, Draco Conflagratio Horribilis for the red dragon. More importantly, AD&D started to expand the lore around these creatures. Bahamut and Teeamat, introduced in the Greyhawk supplement, were now fully integrated. Teeamat was listed as the chromatic dragon with 5 heads, 1 for each color of evil dragon dwelling in the 9 hells, and Bahamut as the platinum-scaled ruler of the good dragons. In effect, dragons now had deities of their own, setting them apart as a special kind of monster with a place in the cosmos. Early AD&D modules cemented dragons as premier antagonists. In the Dragonlance saga, which we'll discuss more later, entire adventures were built around dragon villains. But even before Dragonlance, modules hinted at dragon encounters. For example, in Gygax's Greyhawk campaign, the rumor of Dragotha the Dracolich, undead dragon, in White Plume Mountain tantalized players in 1979. Other adventures like Sleeping Dragon or homebrew games often featured a dragon as the final boss guarding the treasure hoard. Mechanically, AD&D First Edition also introduced the idea of dragons growing stronger with age. The monster manual gave each dragon a range of hit points depending on age category: young, adult, ancient, etc. So, an ancient dragon could be twice as tough as a young one. Veteran DMs quickly learned that an ancient red dragon was one of the deadliest things you could throw at a party, a foe deserving of respect. Dragons in first edition also could cast spells as they aged. For example, gold and red dragons gained wizard spells, making them even more fearsome and clever. Beyond raw stats, dragons started to get personalities. Dragon entries describe them as highly intelligent, often covetous and arrogant. A footnote in one source even mentioned that some dragons could be negotiated with or bribed instead of fought, a nod to the idea that not every encounter had to be resolved by the sword. And of course, dragons were tied to treasure. The term dragon's hoard became a staple of D&D vocabulary. In the early 1980s, while first edition AD&D was in full swing, TSR, the company behind D&D, also released the basic D&D line, the famous red box set, etc., which presented a simpler version of the game. Dragons remained front and center there too. The 1983 basic set's cover by Larry Elmore of a hero facing a red dragon is iconic. The basic rules featured the same 6 classic dragons from OD&D and later expanded to include gemstone dragons and elemental dragon rulers in the 1991 D&D Rule Cyclopedia. So by the end of first edition, D&D had firmly established dragons as versatile, narrative-rich monsters. They could be villains to slay, clever schemers to outwit, or even occasional allies to those who prove themselves honorable. Teeamat and Bahamut had entered the lexicon as draconic gods, and dragons were appearing not just in rule books, but in novels, art, and the broader pop culture. The 1980s Dungeons & Dragons cartoon even featured Teeamat as a recurring menace. The groundwork was laid for even deeper dragon lore to come. In 1989, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition arrived, and it brought a wealth of new detail to the world of dragons. If first edition established dragons as major monsters, Second edition truly fleshed them out as a people with their own culture, history, and even politics. Early in second edition's life, TSR published one of its most beloved sourcebooks, Draconomicon, 1990. This was the first full-length book entirely about dragons, and it massively expanded their lore. Draconomicon delved into dragon psychology, language, and society. It provided advice for role-playing intelligent dragons. Not every dragon has to immediately fry the party. Maybe it will converse or boast first. It detailed draconic life cycles and philosophies, effectively treating dragons as more than just monsters. They were ancient beings with rich cultures and motivations. The book even had a Dragon Hall of Fame, highlighting famous dragons of the D&D world. Mechanically, AD&D 2nd edition refined the age category system. Dragons now had 12 age categories, from hatchling wormlings to the titanic great worms. A great worm in 2nd edition was truly a force of nature, the product of centuries, or millennia, of growth. These great worms had maximum hit points, prodigious spellcasting, and could rival minor deities in power. This was the addition that firmly planted the idea that as dragons age, they just keep getting stronger and more magical. An elder dragon was exponentially more dangerous than a young one. AD&D 2nd edition also expanded the roster of dragon types dramatically, especially through the monstrous compendium expansions. We saw gem dragons enter mainstream D&D. Amethyst, emerald, sapphire, topaz, and crystal dragons were introduced. They had actually first appeared in a 1980 Dragon magazine article, then were officially added in 2nd edition. These gem dragons were typically neutral in alignment and had psionic powers, adding a new twist beyond the usual chromatic versus metallic dichotomy. Second edition's Monstrous Compendiums and Monstrous Manual, 1993, also added all sorts of exotic dragons. Fairy dragons, tiny pranksters, shadow dragons, deep dragons of the Underdark, oriental dragons in the Forgotten Realms and Karatur settings, like lung dragons, and even planar dragons. By the end of second edition, you could encounter dragons in every environment, from desert sand dragons to mist dragons in swamps. Draconomicon, 1990, itself introduced a few new dragon species like the steel dragon, originally called Greyhawk dragon, and Mercury and yellow dragons. Steel dragons were especially interesting. They prefer human form and live among people incognito, implying a whole hidden society of dragons influencing mortal affairs. The Draconomicon also formalized the draconic language. Draconic discussed dragon magic, detailed the gods' worship by dragons, and even gave rules for dragons as player characters in case a DM let someone play one. It was a treasure trove that deepened the lore and realism of dragonkind in D&D. Around this time, specific dragon deities and legends got more attention too. The second edition sourcebook, Monster Mythology, 1992, detailed the pantheon of dragon gods. Not only Bahamut and Teeamat, but also others like Io, the great eternal dragon, a creator deity in some worlds, Sardior, the ruby dragon, lord of gem dragons, and various child deities of Bahamut and Teeamat. Dragons were shown to have their own religious and mythological tradition, stretching back to the creation of the world. In novels and game lore, dragons became central plot drivers. Perhaps the most influential was the Dragonlance series, which started in first edition but continued in second edition. Dragonlance's whole premise was a world dominated by dragons. Evil chromatic dragons under the Dragon Queen's banner ravaging the land, and the good metallic dragons eventually joining the fight. This setting popularized the view of dragons as thinking beings with loyalties and moral codes. As one source notes, Dragonlance's concept of a world where dragons dominated helped cement the D&D-derived perspective on dragons for many fans. In Krynn, the Dragonlance world, the Platinum Dragon was called Paladine, and the Chromatic Dragon was called Takesis, though we discover in modern lore that Paladine is Bahamut and Takesis is Teeamat in different form. The stories gave us memorable dragon characters: Ruthless Ember, crafty Cyan Bloodbane, ancient worms like Icewall's White Dragon, and the terrifying dragon high lords who rode dragons into battle. In the Forgotten Realms during second edition, dragons also left their mark. The Cult of the Dragon, a group of fanatic cultists, believed that undead dragons, dracoliches, would one day rule the world, and they actively sought to transform dragons into dracoliches. This led to infamous villains like the Dracolic Samaster and his undead dragon allies in the realms. A series of articles called Worms of the North in Dragon Magazine issues 230 to 259 detailed specific famous dragons of Faerun, giving DMs ready-made dragon NPCs with distinct personalities and backgrounds. It was in the second edition that we also got the unique Council of Worms setting, 1994, which let players be dragons. That boxed set provided rules for dragon player characters and described a society of dragon nobles and their vassals. It was a niche but beloved addition, imagining what politics and life might be like among dragons themselves. By the end of AD&D 2nd edition, dragons were no longer just monsters. They were ancient beings with languages, empires, and legends of their own. Whether you faced a scheming great worm red dragon manipulating kingdoms from its lair, or bargained with a wise gold dragon for help, or perhaps joined forces with a dragon against a greater threat, Second edition made sure dragons could fill any narrative role. Little wonder that an AD&D second edition book was titled The Dragon Lord's Chronicles, because indeed, many campaigns felt like chronicles of dealing with dragonkind. And if all that weren't enough, toward the end of the second edition era, TSR released the Year of the Rogue Dragons novel trilogy, showing a magical Dracorage driving dragons insane and causing mayhem across Fyron. Further proof of how central these creatures had become in D&D storytelling. With the launch of D&D 3rd edition in 2000 and its 3.5 revision in 2003, dragons entered a new era of mechanical complexity and player options. 3rd edition is often cited as the edition where dragons received the most detailed and meticulous treatment in terms of game rules. First off, the Core Monster Manual, 2000, presented the familiar 10 true dragons, 5 chromatic, 5 metallic, with updated art and anatomy that became definitive for D&D. Each dragon type had more standardized stats and clearly defined powers. The designers even differentiated species by wing shape and head shape, making the visuals distinct. Dragons were formally categorized as a creature type, dragon type, in the rules, and they benefited from the new mechanics like feats and skills. A Great Worm Red Dragon in 3rd edition might have a list of feats, like Cleave or Snatch, and skill ranks in Perception or Spellcraft, reflecting that these were intelligent, evolved creatures. The age categories were expanded and standardized: Wormling, very young, young, juvenile, young adult, adult, mature adult, old, very old, ancient, worm, and great worm. With each age category, a dragon size, hit dice, damage, and stats increased. Crucially, dragons in 3rd edition gained spellcasting as sorcerers automatically as they aged, making them potent spell slingers in addition to physical power. For example, an adult blue dragon might cast spells like a 5th-level sorcerer, whereas a great worm could cast as a very high-level sorcerer on top of all its other abilities. In essence, a top-tier dragon in 3rd edition was a one-creature army. It had melee prowess, breath weapon, magic, skills, and even damage reduction and spell resistance as high-level monsters got. All these mechanical details meant that dragons were incredibly detailed encounters, and the game provided guidance for running them effectively. Wizards of the Coast also released Draconomicon, the Book of Dragons, 2003, for 3rd edition, which was a fan-favorite tome expanding on dragons much like the 1990 book did. The 3rd edition Draconomicon included exhaustive material, dragon physiology and psychology, new feats and prestige classes specifically for dragons, new dragon spells and magic items, and lair details. It even had rules for aerial combat between flying creatures and nuances of breath weapons. This book was both an art showcase featuring gorgeous dragon illustrations and a toolbox for DMs to make every dragon encounter unique. You could give your dragons feats like hover or flyby attack, or templates making them skeletal dragons, etc., to surprise players. One of the biggest shifts in 3rd edition was the idea that players could directly interact with draconic traits, even playing draconic characters. 3rd edition introduced things like the half-dragon template, allowing any creature, even a player's character, to have dragon blood, and gained some draconic features: scales, breath weapon, wings, etc. It also introduced dragon-related player character races. The most notable were the Dragonborn, introduced late in 3.5 in Races of the Dragon 2006, as a playable race of humanoids reborn with draconic heritage. These Dragonborn, sometimes called Dragonborn of Bahamut, allowed players to finally embody a bit of draconic power in a hero form. They had scales, breath weapons, and a strong connection to dragonkind. They would become even more prominent in 4th edition, but 3rd edition planted the seed by introducing them. Additionally, the Savage Species Supplement, 2003, provided rules for playing full-fledged monster creatures, including dragons, by breaking their abilities into level progressions. Ambitious players could now be a young dragon and level up as a dragon, though this was for high-powered games. 3rd edition also formalized the draconic language and introduced the concept of draconic heritage feats, a series of feats for sorcerers who had dragon blood, granting them scaled skin or minor breath weapons, etc. For example, a sorcerer could take the dragon heritage feat and choose to be descended from green dragons to gain acid resistance and a flair for certain spells. All of this made dragons feel genetically and mystically entwined with the player's world. The lore in 3rd edition expanded the draconic pantheon as well. Deities like Io, previously known in 2nd edition lore, were mentioned in 3rd edition materials as the progenitor of Bahamut and Teeamat. The cosmology of D&D now often assumed there was a great cosmic dragon god, sometimes called Io or Asgarath, who created the first dragons. Deities and demigods, 2002, even gave stats for Teeamat as a deity, reinforcing her role as a god of evil dragons. Dragonlance in the 3rd edition era reconfirmed that Paladin equals Bahamut and Takisis equals Teeamat in different worlds, effectively unifying those mythologies. Meanwhile, campaign settings like the Forgotten Realms had dragons play major roles in events. The Rage of Dragons, Dracaraj, was a plot in 3rd edition's Forgotten Realms. Dragons of Faerun, 2006 supplement, tied to that earlier novel trilogy. Eberron, a brand new setting introduced in 2004, gave us a world where dragons are ancient conspirators. In Eberron's myth, 3 dragon progenitors created the world: Cyberus, Eberron, Kyber, and dragons live in a distant continent, Argonason, studying the prophecy, occasionally manipulating events in secret. Eberron also allowed dragons of any color to be any alignment, shattering the usual color alignment linkage in that setting. This was a refreshing take. A good red dragon or an evil gold dragon was entirely possible in Eberron, keeping players on their toes. At the highest levels of play, 3rd edition also introduced truly godlike dragons. The Epic Level Handbook, 2002, presented dragons so powerful they were essentially legends. For instance, the Prismatic Dragon, an epic multicolored dragon of immense power, or Great Worm Planar dragons, with challenge ratings in the 40s, 50s, even 66 plus. These epic dragons were beyond the scope of most campaigns, but demonstrated that theoretically, dragons could just keep scaling up. A Great Worm Gold Dragon in 3.5 could hit challenge rating 27 plus, making it a potential ally or enemy on par with Demon Lords. In summary, D&D 3rd edition / 3.5 took all the lore from prior editions and gave it mechanical teeth. Dragons were detailed down to the ounces of weight they could carry in flight. They were given roles in ecology, hunting patterns, favorite foods, and even social behavior. Some dragons might adopt local humanoids as agents or worshippers. And importantly, 3rd edition invited players to partake in draconic heritage themselves, whether by playing a dragon descendant or even a young dragon outright. It was a golden age for dragon aficionados, supported by texts like Draconomicon, 2003, which is often regarded as one of the best supplements of that era for the sheer depth of dragon options. If you wanted to run an all-dragon campaign or have the final villain be an ancient dragon god, 3rd edition gave you the tools to do it in spades. In 2008, D&D 4th edition arrived with some bold changes to the game's mechanics and lore, and dragons were not exempt from this shakeup. One of 4th edition's goals was to streamline gameplay and put all creatures, even the mighty dragons, on a more balanced footing for tactical combat. At the same time, the 4th edition designers reimagined parts of the D&D cosmology, and in doing so, they tweaked the mythology of dragons and their gods in fascinating ways. Mechanically, 4th edition made dragons into truly climactic encounters by designating them as solo monsters, meaning a single dragon was intended to be a fair fight against an entire party of adventurers. To achieve this, dragons in 4th edition had multiple actions and special abilities that let them influence the battlefield. For example, a typical adult dragon in 4th edition could bite, claw, and use its breath weapon in the same round by expending action points, and it had reactive tail slaps or wing buffets to keep multiple foes at bay. This made fighting a dragon feel dynamic and cinematic. The dragon might knock characters prone with a wing gust or create zones of elemental danger, like a lightning storm for a blue dragon. Dragons also had lair-based powers in some cases, and each type got unique tricks. A green dragon could create illusory duplicates, a white dragon could create freezing fog, etc. Notably, 4th edition decided to relax the traditional alignment strictness for dragons. The monster manual stated that chromatic dragons were not always evil, and metallic dragons not always good, breaking a long-held convention. This change was partly to allow more story flexibility. Your players might find an honorable red dragon or a treacherous gold dragon in a 4th edition game. The default assumption, though, was still that chromatics tend toward selfishness and metallics toward honor. 4th edition also introduced entirely new categories of dragons. The chromatic and metallic dragons returned, of course, though interestingly, the initial monster manual, 2008, only included chromatics. Metallic dragons were added in a later supplement. But 4th edition added things like catastrophe dragons, embodiments of natural disasters like volcanic eruptions or blizzards, which were purely evil engines of destruction. It introduced planar dragons, dragons warped by the magic of other planes, for example, a magma dragon from the elemental chaos. It even included oddballs like scourge dragons. However, the gem dragons, amethyst, etc., were notably absent in 4th edition until much later. They sat out this edition. One of the most visible additions of 4th edition was the Dragonborn becoming a core player race. While Dragonborn had been quietly introduced in 3.5, 4th edition put them front and center. A proud race of draconic humanoids, complete with a rich history in the New Points of Light default setting. In 4th edition's mythos, the Dragonborn were said to have had an ancient empire and were often associated with dragons. Some lore said they were creations or scions of dragon gods. Players could choose Dragonborn as a race right out of the player's handbook, giving them dragon-like traits: a breath weapon, a knack for combat, and an imposing stature of scaled skin. This made the connection between player characters and dragonkind stronger than ever, as many adventuring parties now had a literal dragon-blooded member in their ranks. On the lore front, 4th edition dramatically rewrote the story of Bahamut and Teeamat. The new core cosmology, the Dawn War myth, revealed that in the beginning there was a great dragon god called Io, who was slain in battle against primordial forces. Upon Io's death, his essence split, giving birth to the twin deities Bahamut and Teeamat, making them literally two halves of a whole. This was a big departure from earlier editions where Bahamut and Teeamat were often depicted as siblings or eternal rivals, created by a higher power like Io or a law versus chaos dichotomy, depending on the lore. In 4th edition, Bahamut, god of justice, protection, and good dragons, and Teeamat, goddess of greed, vengeance, and evil dragons, both became part of the standard D&D pantheon, not just dragon worship. Bahamut was worshipped by paladins and knighthoods, and Teeamat was revered by power-hungry cultists and even devils. Another new deity introduced in 4th edition's pantheon was Zahir, the evil god of darkness, poison, and snakes. While not a dragon god per se, Zahir entered draconic lore by becoming an antagonist to Teeamat. In the Dawn War story, Teeamat invaded Zahir's nightmarish realm of Tytharian, seeking to usurp it, and the two ended up in a stalemate, with Teeamat claiming the caverns below and Zahir keeping the darkness above. This enmity was a unique 4th edition twist. Teeamat essentially at war with another deity, not Bahamut for a change but a snake god, adding depth to her role. The portrayal of Teeamat in 4th edition's monster manual also emphasized her as a full-fledged goddess, complete with aspects and exarchs, rather than just a very powerful monster. Meanwhile, Bahamut walked the world in 4th edition mythology in the guise of an old man called the Platinum Dragon, or the Dragon King, helping mortals in need, a very mythic, almost Arthurian depiction. 4th edition's Draconomicon came in 2 volumes, Chromatic Dragons, 2008, and Metallic Dragons, 2009, each providing tons of game material for using dragons in this edition. They added new dragon types like the brown, sand dragon, gray, fang dragon, and purple, deep dragon, which were actually conversions of dragons that had existed in earlier lore under different names. They also presented options for draconic encounters, lair set pieces, and advice on how to stage multi-tier fights, for example, battling a dragon in the air, and then in its collapsing lair. In 4th edition's default setting points, dragons were fewer but mighty. A dragon might rule a large territory single-handedly. The dragonborn race's backstory often tied to dragons. For instance, some dragonborn clans were said to serve under dragons, or pursue the perfection of dragon-like virtues. In the Metallic Dragons book, even Bahamut and his exarchs, servants, received attention, and there were new minor dragon gods, or exarchs, mentioned, though Bahamut, Teeamat, Io remain the major figures. One more change worth mentioning: 4th edition adjusted dragon alignment slightly, e.g., traditionally all gold, silver, and bronze dragons had been lawful good, but 4th edition allowed more flexibility. A few metallics could be unaligned or have different moral leanings. Also in 4th edition, dragons did not automatically speak all languages or cast spells as before. Instead, they had innate magical powers flavored to each type, making them feel more like elemental forces. For example, a 4th edition red dragon might not cast spells, but it could create a fiery explosion or superheat the ground. This streamlined approach sometimes meant dragons lost some of their earlier editions' spellcaster vibe, but they gained unique thematic powers. Overall, 4th edition's approach to dragons was streamlined, story-rich, and combat-focused. Dragons remained terrifying bosses. If one showed up in a 4th edition adventure, players knew they were in for a set-piece battle. The introduction of Dragonborn as a core race also meant that the image of a heroic dragon man wielding a sword became a staple of D&D art and tables. And by reshaping the cosmic backstory, Io's sacrifice, birth in Bahamut and Teeamat, 4th edition gave dragons a new myth that underscored their importance in the world's divine history. Love it or hate it, 4th edition kept dragons at the center of D&D's identity, while experimenting with fresh ideas of how they fit into the world and the game. Launched in 2014, D&D 5th edition sought to capture the classic feel of earlier editions while simplifying rules. In many ways, 5th edition's portrayal of dragons is a homage to the earliest lore with a few new innovations to keep things fresh. The Core Monster Manual, 2014, reintroduced the 5 chromatic dragons, black, blue, green, red, white, and 5 metallic dragons, brass, bronze, copper, gold, silver, in familiar fashion, evil versus good, each with their trademark breath weapons and personalities. 5th edition trimmed the age categories down to 4 broad ones: wormling, young, adult, and ancient, a bit of a nod to the simpler basic D&D approach. However, dragons in 5th edition retained the concept of growing more powerful with age. An ancient dragon in 5th edition is an engine of destruction and wisdom, as it should be. One of the hallmark innovations of the 5th edition was the introduction of legendary and lair actions, especially for powerful creatures like dragons. Ancient and adult dragons in 5th edition are treated as legendary creatures, which means they get special actions that they can use outside their turn, legendary actions, and have unique effects tied to their lairs, lair actions. This mechanic makes fighting a dragon a truly epic encounter. For example, on initiative count 20 every round, an ancient dragon's lair might trigger a regional effect. An adult red dragon's volcano lair can erupt with gouts of lava, or an ancient green dragon's forest lair might ensnare heroes in grasping roots and vines. These regional effects and lair actions mean that a dragon literally warps the land around its home, a concept that brings the old idea of a dragon's influence to life in rules. The 5th edition Monster Manual descriptions emphasize this. If a dragon lives in an area, the weather, the vegetation, even local wildlife start to reflect that dragon's elemental nature and mood. For instance, near a white dragon's lair, blizzards become frequent and the entire region may turn unnaturally frigid. Near a green dragon's lair, the forest grows twisted and poisonous. This is a very mythic take, the land itself reacting to the dragon's presence, and adds immersion for storytelling. In terms of alignment and personality, 5th edition largely returned to the traditional approach. Chromatic dragons are presented as brutal, selfish, and arrogant, typically evil, while metallic dragons are noble, curious, and often altruistic, typically good. That said, 5th edition's texts always allow individual exceptions. A DM can certainly create a kind-hearted young red dragon or a cruel silver, but the expected behaviors are classic. Dragons are described as schemers who might slumber for decades on their hoards or dominate territories as apex predators. 5th edition, through adventures and sourcebooks, also brought dragons into the forefront of storytelling. The very first published adventures for 5th edition were the 2-part Tyranny of Dragons campaign, 2014, which involved the Cult of the Dragon, Remember Them from 2nd edition Forgotten Realms, attempting to summon Teeamat into the world. This campaign firmly re-established Teeamat as a big bad, culminating in a potential confrontation with the 5-headed Dragon Queen herself. Meanwhile, on the good side, the 5th edition Player's Handbook included paladin orders devoted to Bahamut, and a reprinting of Dragonborn as a core player race, now with chromatic or metallic ancestry options affecting their breath weapon. One of the most significant 5th edition products for dragon lore is Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, released in 2021. This book is essentially the 5th edition answer to the old Draconomicon, and it both revisits classic material and introduces some fascinating new concepts. In a very meta twist, the book is presented as the writings of Fizban, a character from Dragonlance, who is an avatar of Paladin, the Platinum Dragon in that story. Fizban's voice in the text adds a light, grandfatherly tone to the lore, but the substance is huge. Fizban's Treasury reintroduced gem dragons to 5th edition, amethyst, crystal, emerald, sapphire, topaz, and provided full rules for them. It also formalized a concept of great worms in 5th edition, dragons so ancient and powerful that they begin to tap into godlike power. In game terms, great worms are like an even higher tier of dragon, beyond ancient, that can rival demigods. These correspond to the great worm idea from older editions, but with fresh 5th edition mechanics. Fizban's also added new player options like dragon-themed subclasses, e.g., Way of the Ascendant Dragon Monk, Drake Warden Ranger, and variants of Dragonborn, letting players make chromatic, metallic, or gem Dragonborn with distinct breath weapon effects. But perhaps the most intriguing part of Fizban's is the expansion of draconic mythology. It introduced the concept of the First World, a singular world in the D&D multiverse that Bahamut and Teeamat created together in the dawn of time, which was a paradise for dragons. When that first world was destroyed, the book implies it shattered during a cosmic conflict. Its fragments became all the worlds of the material plane, and dragons were scattered across the multiverse. This lore ties all D&D settings together under a unified dragon origin story. In this myth, Bahamut and Teeamat are siblings, children of a greater entity called Sardior in some versions, or of the universe itself. Sardior, the ruby dragon, is said to have been the first dragon. In Fizban's, it's revealed that Sardior was shattered into 1,000 pieces in that ancient war, and those pieces became the gem dragons. Now the gem dragons work subtly to reconstruct Sardior, almost a draconic resurrection story. This is a fascinating evolution of the draconic pantheon, effectively elevating Sardior to a creator figure, or at least a firstborn scion of Bahamut and Teeamat. Fizban's also confirms across settings that Paladin equals Bahamut and Takisis equals Teeamat, and even nods to Greyhawk by name-dropping Io and showing how each setting views these dragon gods. The book paints Teeamat in a slightly more complex light, suggesting her rivalry with Bahamut isn't just she's evil because evil, but because of a fundamental difference in how they see dragons' place in the cosmos. In 5th edition's default stance, though, Bahamut is the wise, compassionate platinum dragon god, and Teeamat is the furious, domineering chromatic dragon goddess. Classic portrayals that resonate with longtime fans. Another return to classic roots in 5th edition, the idea of dragon sight and echoes. Fizbans describes that ancient dragons and great worms begin to perceive their echoes across the multiple worlds of the material plane, and some can even merge with or draw power from these alternate selves. So an ancient dragon in the Forgotten Realms might be dimly aware of its counterpart living a different life, in Greyhawk or Eberron, for instance. If one manages to merge these echoes, it can achieve Great Worm status, effectively transcending a single world. This cool multiversal twist reinforces that dragons in 5th edition have one foot in legend. At all times, they are mythic, almost archetypal beings that exist in many worlds. In gameplay, 5th edition dragons may not have as many fiddly bits as in 3rd edition. No skill points or long spell lists by default, but they are streamlined and potent. An ancient dragon has a high armor class, massive hit points, multiple area attacks, and clever tactics. The guidance given to DMs is to play dragons as intelligent and proud. A dragon won't just sit in its cave and wait. It might scry on intruders, set traps, or call minions. The monster manual even notes that some dragons keep humanoid agents or worshippers maintaining networks of influence. Story-wise, 5th edition has used dragons in various published adventures. A green dragon in Lost Mine of Phandelver, a white dragon as a threat in Rime of the Frost Maiden, a showdown with an evil green dragon in Sleeping Dragon's Wake, and of course the entire Tyranny of Dragons plot. And outside tabletop, dragons have been prominently featured in D&D's crossover to other media. For example, the Magic the Gathering crossover sets, the D&D movie Honor Among Thieves, featuring a classic red and a fat black dragon cameo, etc. All these show that in the current era, dragons are front and center as emblems of D&D. 5th edition effectively reveres the legacy of dragons, bringing back classic elements like alignments and famous named dragons, while also adding new layers of myth. The First World, Sardior's Shards, Great Worms, to ensure even the oldest fan learns something new about dragonkind. It's a balancing act between tradition and innovation, much like 5th edition itself. And with Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, modern D&D has a rich repository of dragon lore that will no doubt inform tales around gaming tables for years to come. Dragons are so fundamental to D&D that every published campaign setting has put its own spin on them. Let's take a quick tour of how different worlds treat their dragons. You'll see they range from aloof schemers to central protagonists in world history. Perhaps the setting most defined by dragons, Dragonlance, was conceived with the idea, what if an entire war revolved around dragons? The Dragonlance world's gods include Paladin, good, and Takesis, evil, who are mirror versions of Bahamut and Teeamat. In Dragonlance's War of the Lance, evil chromatic dragons were the shock troops of the villainous dragon armies, opposed only late in the war by the good metallic dragons. This setting gave us epic dragon villains like the wicked black dragon Kisanth, who laired in Zaktsaroth, and heroic dragon allies like the silver dragon Dargent, disguised as a beautiful Lady Silver. Kryn's dragons were intelligent and often capable of speech and magic, yet initially were manipulated by the dragon high lords, evil dragon-riding generals. In later ages, Dragonlance introduced dragon overlords, gargantuan dragons from other worlds, who conquered parts of Krynn in the Fifth Age, each the epitome of their color. For example, Malastrix the Red was so large and powerful she warped the land around her, raising volcanoes in Ansalon. Dragonlance firmly established the idea of dragon-on-dragon warfare, and even the notion of using magical lances and orbs to fight dragons, emphasizing how dangerous these creatures are. In novels, dragons like Sky, an ancient blue, and Ember, a red, had distinct personalities and story arcs. Dragonlance showed that dragons could be protagonists in the world's mythology. When the gods vanished, dragons reshaped the land themselves. To many fans, the word dragon immediately brings to mind the cover of Dragons of Winter Night, with a dragon high above the battlefield. Krynn's use of dragons as both nearly unstoppable forces and deeply characterized beings set a standard for D&D storytelling. The Forgotten Realms is a sprawling world, and dragons there are numerous and varied, but often operate in the background of human and elven affairs until they don't. The realms has its own dragon gods, also Bahamut and Teeamat, though sometimes under other names like Zymor for Bahamut in older lore. One unique realms organization is the Cult of the Dragon, which fervently believes in a prophecy that dead dragons shall rule the world entire. These cultists actively work to create dracoliches, undead dragons, by convincing evil dragons to undergo vile rituals. As a result, the realms has some infamous dracoliches like Shardan Vitriol, Ebundith, and Orgloroasa, who terrorized regions with the cult's backing. The realms also had the Dracaraj Mythol, a magical effect that caused all dragons to go berserk at certain intervals. This was the basis of the Year of Rogue Dragons events, where countless dragons ravaged Faerun in an uncontrollable rage. That event spawned heroes and villains among dragonkind, including the tale of an adventuring party having to cure the madness. The realms features many famous dragons in its lore. Thoglor the Black Doom, who once dominated Cormyr's skies. Clouth, Old Snarl, one of the oldest and wickedest red dragons who still lives in the north, hoarding an unbelievable trove. Imrith, an ancient blue dragon who infiltrated human courts, featured as a villain in the Storm King's Thunder adventure. Samaster, who, while not a dragon, was a mage who became a Dracolich and founded the Cult of the Dragon. Forgotten Realms. Dragons often have individual agendas. One might secretly rule a city in humanoid guise. Another might be sleeping for decades until awoken by foolish treasure hunters. The Worms of the North articles gave nearly every notable region a unique dragon with a backstory, essentially sprinkling dragon NPCs throughout the continent of Faerun. The variety in the realms is staggering. You have kind dragons like song dragons, water dragons who can become human and love music, and you have terrors like shade dragons, corrupted by shadow magic. The realms encapsulates the idea that there's always a bigger fish. No matter how high level your characters get, there's probably a dragon somewhere that can still pose a challenge. But those dragons are integrated into the world's history, religion, and politics in a way that makes encounters meaningful. For instance, in one story, the city of Waterdeep was secretly protected for centuries by a slumbering gold dragon, Orunax, in its depths. As the original D&D campaign setting, Gary Gygax's world, Greyhawk's use of dragons was relatively sparse in published material, but significant in impact. In Greyhawk lore, Teeamat and Bahamut were first introduced, though not called by name initially, just the chromatic and platinum dragons. So the setting's contribution is basically all of D&D got those concepts from it. A notable Greyhawk dragon is Dragotha, mentioned earlier, a mighty red dragon who became the first draconic. In the Greyhawk campaign, Dragotha was rumored to be the consort of Teeamat at one time, and his undead remains lurked in an ancient tomb. This draconic was later used as a major villain in the Age of Worms adventure path in Dungeon Magazine, cementing his legend across editions. Greyhawk also had Greyhawk dragons, later called steel dragons, which, as mentioned, lived among humans in disguise. Generally in Greyhawk tales, if a dragon showed up, it was usually as a singular menace or a mystery. One of Gygax's early modules, Dungeonland, even cheekily included a mock Jabberwock, a dragon-like creature from Lewis Carroll, as an encounter. The famous Temple of Elemental Evil module features a young black dragon as a potential encounter, demonstrating that even in a cult-filled dungeon, a dragon can make a surprise appearance. Overall, Greyhawk's dragons are less ubiquitous than in the realms or Dragonlance, but they are present as high-level threats. The World of Greyhawk sourcebook lists dragon sightings in various regions, and dragons are part of the pantheon via Teeamat, Bahamut, and Io in later insertions. In some, Greyhawk treats dragons as rare, storied beasts. When one is encountered, it's a legendary day for the adventurers. The Eberron campaign setting, introduced in 2004, took a very different approach. Here, dragons are ancient masterminds. In Eberron's creation myth, 3 dragon progenitors form the world: Cybris, the dragon above; Eberron, the dragon between; and Kyber, the dragon below. Normal dragons are said to be the children of Cybris. They live primarily on the continent of Argonneson, where they have their own continent-spanning draconic nation. These dragons largely keep to themselves, studying the draconic prophecy, a grand mystical prophecy encoded in the world's patterns of nature and magic. Dragons in Eberron feel it's their role to watch younger races from afar and intervene only when necessary to guide the prophecy. This means on the main continent, Corvair, dragons are seldom seen, but when they are, it often portends huge events. Notably, Eberron's dragons don't follow the color alignment rule. They are individuals. A blue dragon could be scholarly and kind, while a gold dragon could be vicious, though their species might incline them to certain behavior. They are essentially free-willed. Eberron's mantra is that alignment is not color-coded. An organization called the Chamber consists of dragons who send agents, sometimes themselves, shape-changed into humanoid form, to manipulate events across the world in favor of the prophecy. Opposing them are the Lords of Dust, immortal fiends often allied with evil dragons from Kyber. The result is a shadow war of dragons and demons that most normal folk in Eberron have no idea is even happening. Eberron also gave us cool twists like dragon shards, crystals from the progenitor dragons' bodies that power magic, shape-shifting lizard folk dragon-born, called kobolds, and actual dragonborn exist too, each claiming descent from dragons differently, and even undead dragons that guard epic treasures, the caretakers of the mysterious city of Iolanthe. One of the most famous Eberron dragons is Argonneson itself, the Society, but named dragons like Tirlach, an observer in humanoid form, or Sarmadalarix, the dragon below who slumbers under Sharn, appear in lore. What Eberron teaches is that dragons can be behind-the-scenes string pullers in your campaign. That kindly old sage giving you a quest, or that enigmatic patron could secretly be a dragon in disguise, nudging you toward a fate that fulfills a prophecy. And unlike many settings, an Eberron dragon might just as soon help you as eat you, depending on its goals. Every setting has its dragons. In Dark Sun, Athas, typical dragons didn't exist. Instead, the dragon of Tyr was a singular sorcerer king who transformed himself into a dragon-like entity through defiling magic. This dragon was a near unstoppable ravager, illustrating a very different take. On Athas, humans become the dragon, and there's essentially only one, until he's slain in the novels. In Mystara, the classic D&D known world, dragons were integrated into the pantheon with great dragon rulers for each element, as mentioned with Pearl, Diamond, Opal in the Cyclopedia. Mystara even had an immortal, god-tier dragon named the Great One, essentially the god of all dragons in that world. Planescape and the Outer Planes introduced planar dragons like radiant dragons in the Silver Void of Space or battle dragons fighting in the Eternal Blood War. Ravenloft, the Domains of Dread, twisted dragons into horrific forms too, e.g., the domain of Scythicus was ruled by a dragon man Dark Lord, and one domain even had a vampiric dragon as its master. Spelljammer, the spacefaring setting, had solar dragons and lunar dragons gliding among the stars. And Council of Worms, though not a world per se, posited an island chain where dragons were the rulers and mortal demi-human clans served them, a whole society built by dragons for dragons. In all these settings, we see the adaptability of D&D's central draconic archetype. Sometimes they are gods, sometimes villains, sometimes sages, sometimes even player characters, but they are always important. From Kryn's battlefields to Eberron's secret libraries to Faerûn's lonely mountain peaks, dragons find a way to shape the destiny of worlds. Campaign settings have given us unforgettable named dragons, Bahamut and Teeamat in almost every world under different guises. Sapphire, the moon dragon of Mystara ruling chaos. Flame, Emerith, the blue who took human form to infiltrate Storm King's thunder. Protanther, the proud gold dragon diplomat in Tyranny of Dragons. Valameridus, the dragon queen of Cormyr. A famous gold dragon in the realms, Ice, Fire, and Sky, the nicknamed dragon overlords of Kryn's Fifth Age. Each is a legend in their own right. The key takeaway is that D&D dragons are versatile. They fit into any narrative role: tyrant, ally, force of nature, ancient sage, demigod. This flexibility across settings has only enhanced their mystique. No matter what world you play in, when a dragon shows up, it's a big deal. Entire campaigns might revolve around appeasing, stopping, or partnering with one. They truly are the thread that ties the multiverse of D&D together, as 5th edition literally codifies with the first world myth. Dragons are unique among D&D monsters in that they have their own pantheon of deities and divine figures that have evolved along with the game's additions. These draconic gods illustrate how the lore has deepened and shifted, giving players and DMs a rich tapestry of myth to draw from when it comes to dragons' place in the cosmos. Tiamat is arguably the most famous dragon deity in D&D, often serving as a primary antagonist in both lore and adventures. She began in the 1975 Greyhawk supplement, simply as the chromatic dragon, a singular five-headed monster ruling the evil dragons. AD&D First Edition gave her the name Teeamat, linking her to the Babylonian myth of a chaos dragon defeated by Marduk, and placed her in Avernus, the first layer of hell, as a sort of arch-fiend and goddess who spawns evil dragon kind. Over editions, Tiamat's legend grew. In many worlds, she is worshipped by evil cultists, e.g. the cult of the Dragon Queen. She is often depicted as a colossal dragon with 5 heads, each head a different chromatic color. Her role and status have shifted depending on edition. Second edition's Monster Mythology and Draconomicon treated her as a lesser god, or an archfiend in some contexts. Whereas third edition sources like Deities and Demigods and Fiendish Codex II solidified her as a lesser deity, divine rank till lesser, with influence over evil dragons, greed, and vengeance. In fourth edition, as discussed, she was one of the major gods of evil, at war with Zahir and commanding exarchs, a full-fledged goddess in the pantheon. Fifth edition portrays her as a deity trapped in the 9 hells, yearning to escape, as seen in the Rise of Teeamat adventure where heroes try to prevent her return. Throughout all portrayals, a few things are consistent. Teeamat is incredibly arrogant, cruel, and greedy. She embodies the worst traits of dragonkind: pride, avarice, and wrath. Yet she's also cunning. Many a time she has been the devil on the shoulder for villains, bargaining to aid mortals if they'll only free her or serve her. Her 5-headed form is instantly recognizable, making her a sort of mascot for D&D villains. She even appeared in the 80s D&D cartoon as a near-invincible foe the heroes had to flee from. Over the editions, new details popped up. In some canon, Tiamat has chromatic dragon children, such as the so-called Spawn of Tiamat, introduced in a 2380 edition. Late 2nd edition Dragon magazine and fleshed out in 3rd edition's Races of the Dragon, unique half-dragon creatures, each embodying one chromatic aspect. She also has an eternal rivalry with Bahamut, of course. In some lore, one of Tiamat's aspects was even worshipped in Unther, a Forgotten Realms ancient human empire, as the deity Tiamat, until she was defeated by Marduk, echoing real-world myth in D&D history. To sum up Tiamat, she is the eternal dragon empress of evil, always scheming to increase draconic dominion and her own power. Across universes, when 5 dragon heads erupt from a portal, adventurers know things have gotten serious. On the flip side, Bahamut, also called the Platinum Dragon, or in some worlds by names like Zymor or Paladine, stands for all that is good and noble in dragonkind. He, too, first appeared in the Greyhawk supplement, 1975, as the unnamed leader of the lawful good dragons. AD&D gave him the name Bahamut, drawing from Arabic mythology of a great fish supporting the world, interestingly, and the title King of Good Dragons. In early lore, Bahamut was depicted as a platinum-scaled dragon of awe-inspiring size who often traveled the world in disguise. As a humble old man or with a retinue of canaries, actually 7 gold dragon polymorphed servants, he had no interest in treasure. Instead, wisdom, law, and goodness were his treasures. In 2nd edition, Bahamut was detailed in monster mythology as a deity of good dragons, and interestingly, in the Forgotten Realms, he was said to serve under the god of justice Tyr as an aspect for a time, showing a blending of pantheons. 3rd edition firmly established Bahamut as a lesser deity in his own right, patron of metallic dragons and dragonborn who follow justice. Many paladins and good clerics venerate Bahamut as well, taking him as a symbol of protection and honor. 4th edition put Bahamut in the core pantheon as the god of justice, protection, and hope, essentially merging him with the concept of the lawful good night's god, which in previous settings might have been served by deities like Tyr or Hieronius. In 4th edition's story, as we saw, he and Teeamat are the children of Io's split essence. Bahamut often has a softer approach. He's more likely to mentor or guide mortal heroes than directly smite villains, though he can if needed. Many settings have unique lore for Bahamut. In Dragonlance, he was Paladin, one of the head gods of light, who eventually sacrificed his godhood to stop Takesis, an intriguing resolution where both major dragon gods exit the stage in the 5th Age, leaving mortal dragons to find their own path. In Eberron, Bahamut is not explicitly present. The myth there cast the force of good as Cyberus. But in the Great Wheel multiverse, Bahamut is very active. In 5th edition, Bahamut is revered by Dragonborn and some humans alike as the Justice Maker. Fizban's treasury cleverly presents Fizban the Fabulous, an eccentric old mage from Dragonlance who, spoiler, was an avatar of Paladin Bahamut, as the guide, thereby giving Bahamut a direct voice in 5th edition's dragon lore. Bahamut's personality is often described as wise, compassionate, but also somewhat remote and beyond petty worldly things. He has a bit of the stern grandfather vibe, disappointed by evil, encouraging good, and not suffering fools lightly. Many a time in D&D fiction, Bahamut has aided heroes in disguise or sent angelic minions, or his famous 7 golden canaries, to intervene when dragons threaten the balance. To believers, Bahamut represents the ideal that power should be used to protect, not oppress. He's a beacon of metallic dragon society. In many worlds, the metallic dragons treat him as their liege. Interestingly, some settings even acknowledge Bahamut and Teeamat as siblings, children of a higher dragon god, or as 2 halves of Io, etc. But whatever the origin, their eternal opposition is a recurring theme, much like law versus chaos or good versus evil personified in dragon form. Io, also known as Asgarath or the Great Eternal Dragon, is the draconic primordial deity, essentially the god of dragon gods. Not every edition highlighted Io, but he's been around in D&D lore since at least 2nd edition. Monster mythology presented Io as the ninefold dragon, the creator of all dragons. In the Great Wheel cosmology, Io is mysterious and aloof, said to have created Bahamut and Teeamat as extensions of himself. Some myths say Io was killed at the beginning of time and his halves became Bahamut and Teeamat. This is exactly the story 4th edition used, though they still called the slain protogenitor Io. In the Forgotten Realms, the name Asgarath is used. Asgarath the World Shaper, the dragon who, according to legend, created the world of Toril, and then fought with the primal sun, or with chaos. And in that battle, the Ice Moon was created, a Bitter Realms myth that involves Asgarath shattering an ice moon called Zotha. In Fizban's treasury, they mention Greyhawk's Io by name, confirming Io equals Asgarath across settings. Io typically is above alignment, depicted sometimes with both a positive and negative aspect. Some art shows Io as a 2-headed gold-black dragon, or a being of shifting color. Few worship Io directly except perhaps dragons who seek a more philosophical or balanced path beyond the extreme alignments. Io's role is mainly mythic. He's there to answer, where did dragons come from? The answer, from Io's form or from Io's children. Some editions gave Io a holy symbol of a 9-pointed star, representing the 9 types of true dragons, before gem dragons made it 10 or more types. In practical terms, Io doesn't usually intervene in mortal affairs. Bahamut and Teeamat do that. Io is more of a cosmic force. In Planescape, there is an outer plane called the material plane, also known as the Outlands, where a realm called the Ninefold Heaven or something might reference Io, though that might have been a fan thing. Officially, Bahamut had a realm in Mount Celestia called Bahamut's Palace, and Teeamat a realm in Bator's first layer. Either way, Io Asgarath's lore has been a connecting fiber, helping DMs justify why in one world Bahamut and Teeamat are siblings, versus in another they're not. Io is the answer. If the DM wants, Io made them from his own essence, making them siblings, or Io empowered them as independent gods, etc. In 5th edition's lore, Fizbans basically merges Io with the concept of the progenitor first world myth. There, Bahamut and Teeamat together fill the creative role. No Io explicitly, though one could say Io is the embodiment of the first world itself. Either way, Io remains in the background, but is a vital piece of the puzzle in earlier canon. The dragon over god who's more a concept than a character. Sardior was introduced initially as the Gem Dragon's deity, or perhaps the first of Gem Dragons. In 2nd edition, 3rd edition lore, Sardior was the neutral ruby dragon who had a floating castle and served as something of a patron of psionics and gem dragons. Sardior wasn't as prominent as Bahamut Teeamat, but Fizban's Treasury 2021 elevated Sardior's story significantly, making Sardior the first child of Bahamut and Teeamat in the first world, who shattered into pieces during the world's destruction. Those pieces became the Gem Dragons. Thus, Sardior is essentially dead in modern times, but through the actions of Gem Dragons might be restored. This almost parallels some real-world myths of a deity who dies and is reborn, or the idea of a cosmic Christ figure for dragons. Sardior in earlier lore was a lesser deity who liked to hang out with mortal gem dragons in a jovial way, and had 5 thanes, one of each gem dragon type, attending him. Now, in 5th edition's myth, Sardior's sacrifice gives a purpose to gem dragons beyond just neutrality. It implies gem dragons might have secret unity to resurrect their progenitor. It's a cool bit of lore. In-game, Sardior is rarely worshipped by non-dragons. Gem dragons themselves revere the concept of Sardior. He's often associated with night, as some texts called Sardior the ruby dragon of twilight who brought dreams. Various settings added minor dragon gods or quasi-deities, for example, Astarinian, a quirky brass dragon deity of invention and play, Astilabor, a neutral goddess of dragons, greed, and wealth, basically the personification of the desire to hoard, seen as not evil but draconic nature. Chronepsis, the silent dragon of fate and death, who judges dragon souls, often depicted as a featureless dragon or dracolic who watches over the end of lives. Faluzur, an evil undead dragon deity of decay, sometimes said to be a facet of Chronepsis, and Garrix, a chaotic evil dragon god of fire and destruction worshipped by some red dragons as a figure of wanton ruin. These were detailed in sources like Monster Mythology, 2nd edition, and various Dragon magazine articles. They represent that within dragon religion, not all dragons necessarily pray to Bahamut or Teeamat. Some have their own smaller cults for specific ideals, like wealth or destruction or enlightenment. In Forgotten Realms, a dragon named Kareska is mentioned as a deity of magic for dragons, and Tamara and Lendis were introduced in some lore as dragon gods of life, light, and justice respectively. In Dragonlance, there were minor dragon gods as well in 3rd edition sourcebooks. While these details can be overwhelming, a DM can pick and choose which draconic deities exist in their world. The big picture is that dragons have a rich spiritual lore. An evil dragon might venerate Teeamat or one of her bloodthirsty aspects. A good dragon might meditate on Bahamut's teachings, and a pragmatic dragon might leave worship to others. Some dragons think themselves as gods. Especially when they accumulate great power, they can be quite megalomaniacal. Across editions, the evolution of these deities often mirrored design shifts. Early on, Bahamut and Teeamat were almost more like unique monsters. By late 2nd edition, 3rd edition, they were fully divine. 4th edition turned them into greater gods within a single pantheon, and 5th edition made them more distant again. Teeamat trapped in hell, Bahamut rarely directly intervening, while reintroducing Io in myth and making Sardior's story pivotal. For players, these dragon gods provide excellent hooks. A warlock might form a pact with Teeamat. A cleric could devote themselves to Bahamut, domains like life or war fitting. A campaign might revolve around stopping a cult from summoning an aspect of one of these gods, very common for Teeamat. And philosophically, having these higher powers underscores that dragons are not just big animals. They are people with faith and religion, and even their own gods watch over them. It adds depth. When you meet an ancient dragon, that dragon might quote scripture from the Book of Bahamut at you, or curse you by the 5 heads of Teeamat. It's part of making them living parts of the world's culture. One last interesting deity is Takesis and Paladin from Dragonlance, which we covered but to link. In 5th edition, they outright confirmed Paladin is Bahamut and Takesis is Teeamat in different form. This was long suspected, as those characters are obviously parallel, but not always official. Now it is, meaning these dragon gods truly span the multiverse with different names and guises. So if you kill Takesis in Dragonlance, as happened in the novels, perhaps Teeamat still lives in hell in the Great Wheel. These could be seen as aspects of an archetypal force that never fully goes away. In summary, the draconic deities show that dragons, despite often acting as self-centered lone agents, do have a sense of something bigger. The evil ones have their dark queen to aspire to, or fear. The good ones have an ideal of justice and mercy to emulate. And above all, the existence of these gods says something profound about dragons. In the cosmos of D&D, dragons matter. They have gods because they themselves are almost demigods on Earth. Heroes may rise and empires fall, but Bahamut and Teeamat continue their celestial chess match through it all, using mortal and dragon alike as pieces in their endless duel. Throughout the annals of Dungeons & Dragons, its modules, novels, and sourcebooks, certain individual dragons have achieved legendary status. These are the dragons whose names make players' eyes light up with recognition, the ones that have challenged generations of PCs or become central characters in fiction. Let's recount a few of the most famous dragons in D&D lore. A name that sends shivers down many an adventurer's spine is Ashar-Dalan, a red dragon of such ferocity that he literally extended his life by replacing his heart with a demon. Introduced in the 3rd edition's Bastion of Broken Souls high-level module, Ashar-Dalan had survived for centuries. When his heart was pierced in battle, he fused with a powerful Baler named Tiamat, embedding the demon's heart in his chest to live on. By the time players meet him, Ashardalon is an ancient red great worm with a Baler's fiery heart, a combination that makes him one of the deadliest creatures in any monster manual. He also features as the overarching menace in the popular Ashardalon board game, and is mentioned in songs and lore for his unnatural longevity. Ashardalon's tale is one of sheer willpower and evil. He refused to die. In doing so, he became something beyond a dragon, almost a force of nature. Adventurers who fought him in Bastion of Broken Souls were in a battle on the astral plane to stop him from consuming unborn souls to replenish his power. Truly an epic end boss. The name Ashardalon has since become synonymous with Big Bad Dragon in many D&D circles. We've spoken of Dragotha before, the notorious draconic first hinted in the Greyhawk module White Plume Mountain. Dragotha was said to be a consort of Teeamat, who abandoned her and stole a great artifact, meeting his end and rising as an undead monstrosity. In the 3rd edition Age of Worms campaign, Dragotha finally got full spotlight. He became a key villain, a draconic, whose phylactery players needed to locate to prevent the summoning of an evil worm god. Dragotha's fearsome reputation and the fact that his lore ties him to Teeamat made him a standout. He's effectively the prototype draconic in D&D lore, the original undead dragon. Anytime you have a giant undead dragon in an adventure, you're paying homage to Dragotha's legacy. Dragonlance gave us many named dragons. Ember, real name Pyros, was the red dragon mount of High Lord Verminard in Dragons of Autumn Twilight, slain by the bronze dragon Flamestrike in an emotionally charged scene. Scion Bloodbane was a green dragon who used his magic to plunge the elven kingdom of Sylvanesti into a nightmare. Perhaps most memorably, Kellandros, Sky, a mighty blue dragon, became a major player in the Dragons of Summer Flame and 5th Age storyline. He was once the mount of the disgraced Knight of Solamnia, Derek, but later became a power in his own right. And in the 5th Age, dragon overlords like Malastrix, Beryl and Threnox, etc. Each took over large territories, with Malastrix, a gargantuan red, effectively reshaping the map. Dragonlance's novels let us get into the heads of these dragons more than most settings. We feel the cunning of Scion Bloodbane as he whispers lies to elven royalty, or the ancient pride of Sky mourning the death of his human partner. And who can forget Silvara, a silver dragon who took human form and fell in love with a knight, Gilthanas, showing a softer, romantic side of dragon lore. These stories cemented dragons not just as bosses, but as characters with desires and conflicts. The Realms has dozens of named dragons, but a few famous ones include the Deep Dragon Trio, from Worms of the North Articles, or the dragon siblings in the novel The Year of Rogue Dragons. There's Chazar, a great red dragon who once posed as a human king in Unther and was later elevated to demigod status, only to disappear mysteriously. Dargothoth, known as the Creeping Doom, is an extremely old black dracolic that haunts the depths under Waterdeep. Shimmergloom was a shadow dragon who seized Mithral Hall and was confronted by the hero Drizzt Do'Urden in R.A. Salvatore's novels. Icing Death, Angelo Acastamazillion, was a white dragon in Salvatore's Icewind Dale novel. Drizzt and Wulfgar's battle with Icing Death and the recovery of a famous Frostbrand scimitar, named Icing Death in its honor, is a classic scene. And Hephaestus, a red dragon in the Finder's Stone trilogy gave us a terrifying villain who was outsmarted by heroes. The realms also had the draconic mythal bring forth all sorts of named dragons causing havoc. One novel villain was Callistra the Green, who laid waste to Cormanthor's woods. With the Worms of the North articles by Ed Greenwood, every one of those dragons has its quirks, like Mistinar Paradnicles, Mist, an ancient mist dragon who was actually quite friendly and curious, or Nalavarothotoril, the devil dragon who nearly destroyed Cormyr during the Rage of Dragons. Niv-Mizzet, though not originally D&D, he's from Magic the Gathering's Ravnica setting. Niv-Mizzet, a powerful ancient dragon, has crossed into D&D through the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. He's an example of a super-intelligent dragon who runs an entire city guild of scientists, very much a dragon as genius trope. His inclusion here is just a nod that even outside core D&D, dragons like him become fan favorites. In current 5th edition Realms lore, Clagiliamatar, nicknamed Old Gnawbone, is an ancient green dragon who haunts the Cryptgarden forest and is known for her bizarre habit of chewing on corpses, hence gnawing bones. She even appears briefly in Storm King's Thunder. Fans love her for the evocative nickname and her terrifying presence so close to civilized lands. Similarly, Imirith, the Doom of the Desert, in Storm King's Thunder became iconic after that 5th edition adventure. An ancient blue dragon impersonating a storm giant oracle, showing the infiltration tactic. The white dragon in Dragon of Icespire Peak, Cryovane, is a young white dragon in the 5th edition starter set too, and while not historically famous, he's one of the first dragons new D&D players might face. The adventure is literally about a dragon terrorizing a region, which is as classic as it gets. This list could go on. Every table likely has a famous dragon from their own campaign too. Perhaps a DM borrowed one of these names, or made their own. For example, many campaigns in the 80s featured a red dragon named Smaug, after Tolkien's or just Inferno or something, personal legends. Famous dragons serve as both foes and sometimes allies. Let's not forget, in many campaigns a good dragon might actually help the heroes. There's the story of Azuredge, a sapphire dragon who aided the Githyanki against the Mind Flayers in Eberron's past. Or Mazer, a gold dragon who patronized heroes in the Council of Worms. In an official 5th edition Adventurers League epic, players even got to ride into battle on the backs of metallic dragons to fight Tiamat's forces, living the fantasy of having a dragon ally. In the end, these legendary dragons become the stars of D&D's greatest stories. They have proper names, they have personalities, and encountering them feels like meeting a celebrity, albeit one that might eat you. The fact that players remember names like Ashardalon or Scion Bloodbane years later speaks to how effective dragons are as both narrative and mechanical centerpieces. They stick in our collective memory. When you're playing D&D and the DM drops a famous dragon name into the storyline, you know it's about to go down. Maybe you'll run, maybe you'll negotiate, or maybe you'll be bold and fight. But the tension in those moments is exactly why dragons are the iconic monster of this game. They create legendary tales. As we look to the future of D&D, with new additions or expansion content on the horizon, one thing is certain. Dragons will continue to be at the heart of the game. But how might they evolve in the coming years? While we can't cast augury with absolute accuracy, we can speculate based on recent trends and the design philosophy that Wizards of the Coast has shown. In recent years, D&D has leaned into the multiverse concept, with products like Fizban's Treasury connecting lore across worlds, and adventure books visiting settings like Ravnica, Theros, and beyond. It wouldn't be surprising to see dragons take on an even more multiversal role. We might get new dragon types tied to specific planes or alternate worlds. For instance, perhaps a future sourcebook will introduce cosmic dragons that swim between the stars, building on Spelljammer's legacy, or temporal dragons that can manipulate time. With the concept of echoes and great worms introduced, maybe we'll see an adventure where players must deal with a dragon that exists in multiple worlds simultaneously, requiring a plan that spans different realities. A truly epic challenge only possible with creatures as inherently legendary as dragons. Mechanically, the current 5th edition dragon stat blocks are being adjusted in the upcoming Monster Manual update, part of the 1D&D initiative. Playtests have shown that WotC is tweaking dragons to be even more dynamic in combat, giving them rechargeable breath weapons, more decisive actions, and making each age category distinct. Expect that trend to continue. Future dragons might have unique actions that trigger at certain health thresholds. Imagine an ancient dragon growing desperate and unleashing an area-wide roar that shakes a castle apart when bloodied. Or more ways to interact with the environment, like collapsing pillars or igniting terrain. The design is steering towards making dragon encounters feel less static. I hit, you hit, and more like a set piece with changing conditions. This could mean in a future Dungeon Master's Guide or module, they'll provide richer guidance on staging dragon battles with environmental hazards, minions, like giving every major dragon a posse of cultists or lesser dragonettes, and objectives beyond slay the dragon, maybe distract the dragon while another team disables the ritual, and so forth. In terms of lore, dragons will likely be part of any major new storyline. If D&D ever moves to a 6th edition, or as they're calling it, just an evolution of 5th edition, they will surely carry forward all the big lore beats from Fizban's. That means Bahamut and Teeamat's relationship and the First World story becomes the standard going forward. So in future stories we might see Sardior's return as a plot line, perhaps an adventure where gem dragons are attempting to resurrect the ruby dragon, and the players must choose to help or hinder. Imagine a campaign where helping could bring balance but also unknown consequences. We might also see more integration of dragons with character options, maybe a class like a dragon rider, or more robust rules for hatching and raising a dragon, something many DMs homebrew because players love the idea of having a pet dragon. On the inclusivity and representation front, D&D has been moving towards more nuanced takes on traditionally evil creatures. They might depict some chromatic dragons with sympathetic angles, like a young red dragon who's trying to break free of Tiamat's influence, etc. The alignment loosening in 4th edition taught designers that while fans enjoy the color coding, they also appreciate when individual dragons can break the mold. Expect future lore to emphasize individual draconic personalities over monolithic, all green dragons do X. For example, maybe a source book will present a council of chromatic dragons arguing over whether to make peace with humanoids, giving villains depth and potentially making room for new dragon NPC allies or at least neutrals. We're already seeing a bit of that in things like The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which had a friendly fairy dragon, though that's more whimsical. Another likely avenue is technology and dragons. As D&D expands, especially with magic, the Gathering crossovers and settings like Eberron, where magic tech exists, we could see things like cyborg dragons or dragons with infused elemental power. Eberron actually had an elemental binder dragon in one game product, a dragon with bound elemental energy. Future settings or adventures might play with that. A dragon augmented by illithid tentacles, or wearing ancient warforged armor. This merges the fantasy of dragons with new twists that fit evolving settings. From a meta perspective, dragons are also incredible marketing icons. Who doesn't love a dragon on a book cover? We can predict that any upcoming core books or major adventures in D&D's future will heavily feature dragons or even center on them. The popularity of Critical Role and other media means we might see named dragons become recurring characters in streamed games or official fiction. Perhaps Vox Machina will battle an ancient one in an upcoming season, prompting an official tie-in. With the D&D movie having shown a distinct types of dragons, the chonky acid-spitting black dragon Themberchaud became a bit of a fan favorite. WotC might lean into unique portrayals, maybe an official stat block for Swamp Wyvern based on that, etc. Bridging media and game. And of course, dragons will continue to inspire DMS to create their own legendary creatures. The game might support that by providing tables or tools for customizing dragons, giving them rare mutations, new breath weapons, prismatic spray breath, anyone, or personality quirks. A Dragon Builder toolkit could appear in a future Dungeon Master's Guide. On the story theme front, I could imagine a future adventure path where the players themselves get imbued with draconic essence, essentially turning the party slowly into dragon-like beings as they gain the favor of Bahamut or the ire of Teeamat. That would be a fun integration of story and mechanics. Maybe literally leveling up gives you scales. D&D has done apotheosis before, players turning into godlike beings. Doing so with draconic power could be an epic endgame twist. Finally, the community's love for dragons ensures they'll keep making appearances. You'll see new miniatures, new art, maybe a coffee table art book of dragons through the editions, and constant discussion on forums like, how would you run a campaign where the players are dragon siblings carving territory? D&D's evolving philosophy of empowering the Dungeon Master to tell unique stories bodes well for dragons. They are extremely versatile tools in the DM's kit, after all. In short, the future likely holds more dragons, new kinds of dragons, and deeper dragon lore. As the game designers refine mechanics, we'll get dragons that are even more thrilling to run and fight. As storytellers expand the multiverse, we'll see dragon plotlines that cross worlds or redefine what dragons can do. But one thing won't change. When players hear a dragon's roar in the distance, they'll sit up straight, grips tighten on dice or controllers, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. That reaction, that unique blend of terror and wonder, is something D&D will continue to cultivate. Dragons are D&D in so many ways, and their future is as limitless as the skies they soar. Thank you for joining this deep dive into D&D lore. If you enjoyed this exploration of dragons and their impact on the game, please like and subscribe for more stories from the multiverse of tabletop adventures. And if you have a favorite dragon memory from your own games, share it in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive, one legendary tale at a time.